My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 51 years old, and the moment my boss deleted the 3 systems I had spent years building, he thought he had finally solved his biggest problem. What he didn't realize was that one phone call later, everything he tried to erase would become the reason I walked into the strongest position of my career. I've spent most of my adult life around data, not the polished kind executives put into slide decks. I mean the real kind. The numbers moving through loans, fraud alerts, compliance reports, wire transfers, and balance sheets at 2 a.m. while someone upstairs sleeps peacefully because they assume the systems underneath them still work. I came up through operational work, midnight failures, broken reporting chains, emergency reconciliations, the kind of pressure where a mistake doesn't embarrass a company. It costs real money. That was the world I understood. And for a long time, I thought Brighton Financial Group respected that kind of work too. When I joined Brighton, it felt like one of the rare banks where people still spoke honestly to each other. Compliance could walk downstairs and ask direct questions. Fraud analysts sat beside engineers. Problems got solved by the people closest to them, instead of disappearing into committees. It wasn't perfect. There were patch systems and ancient reporting processes held together by institutional memory and caffeine, but it worked. During my first few years there, my team built systems that mattered, not flashy systems, useful ones. That distinction became very important later. Everything changed when my old director left and Brighton hired Daniel Mercer. On paper, Daniel looked untouchable. Stanford MBA, 15 years consulting major corporations on digital transformation, conference speaker, strategic leadership expert, the kind of man executives immediately trust because he sounds expensive. But within weeks, I realized something else. He had never actually carried operational responsibility for production systems. He had never been the person getting called at 3 a.m. because a broken data process was freezing downstream reporting. He knew how to talk about systems. He did not know how to live inside them. The first thing he changed was cosmetic. New office layout, motivational wall art, buzzwords about scalable frameworks and modernization. Then the language started changing. Every internal tool became a point solution. Every custom workflow became shadow technology. Every practical fix became organizational risk. If you've ever worked under someone who renames useful work until it sounds dangerous, then you already know the feeling. The first real collision between us came over a fraud detection model I had built about a year before he arrived. Brighton's vendor software was missing suspicious transactions until hours after the damage was done, sometimes days later. For credit card fraud, that was expensive. For wire fraud, it was catastrophic. So I built an internal machine learning model that monitored transaction behavior in near real time using patterns the vendor system barely considered. Device sequences, geographic anomalies, transaction velocity, behavioral irregularities, only visible when you actually understood the bank's internal data. It wasn't perfect at launch. Real systems never are. Every 2 weeks, I met with the fraud team, tuned false positives, adjusted variables, improved accuracy. Over time, the model became extremely effective. By the time Daniel arrived, it had prevented more than $2.1 million in fraudulent transactions the vendor software had missed. To me, that number was evidence. To Daniel, it was a governance problem. In one meeting, he asked, how many internal hours had gone into development and maintenance? I told him honestly. Then he brought up the vendor contract. We're already paying Apex Insight. $180,000 annually, he said. Why are we duplicating functionality internally? I explained calmly that we weren't duplicating it. We were catching what the vendor missed. Even after internal labor costs, the bank was still massively ahead financially. Daniel nodded. The way people nod when they are waiting for you to stop talking, so they can return to their own conclusion. He started using phrases like scalability, supportability, key person dependency. I told him the documentation existed. Other engineers understood the system. It was maintainable. He thanked me for the context. That word became one of his favorites. Whenever he intended to ignore reality politely. At first, I thought we simply disagreed professionally. Then came the churn model. Brighton's retail banking division had a quiet but serious customer retention problem. Executives blamed interest rates. Competitors were offering better savings yields. But when I studied the data, the customers leaving didn't behave like rate chasers. Their engagement was deteriorating before they closed accounts. Smaller deposits, fewer transactions, shorter app sessions. It looked less like pricing pressure and more like relationships slowly dying. So I built a churn prediction system using 3 years of behavioral data. The model flagged high-risk customers, early and fed relationship managers, daily intervention lists with suggested actions, not robotic scripts. Human touch points, calls, reviews, conversations. In the first quarter alone, Brighton retained nearly $4.8 million in deposits from customers likely to leave. The retail vice president loved it. Daniel hated how it happened. The project had originally been scoped as a 40-hour exploratory analysis. I spent over 100 hours refining and integrating it into the customer management platform. He focused entirely on that. You exceeded approved project scope, he said. I told him the result retained millions in deposits. He told me my behavior showed a pattern. That was the first moment I understood the real issue. The bigger the success became, the more dangerous it was to him, because it proved value could exist outside his process structure. 6 months later, the third collision finally broke whatever remained between us. Brighton's compliance reporting was a nightmare. Analysts manually pulled data from multiple systems, reconciled discrepancies by hand, and reformatted reports for regulators every quarter. It took between 40 and 60 hours each cycle. Worse, reconciliation mistakes had already caused 2 material restatements. The chief compliance officer came directly to me because she wanted something that actually worked. I spent 8 weeks building an automated regulatory pipeline that extracted data from 7 systems, reconciled discrepancies, automatically flagged issues for review, and generated standardized reporting outputs. The first reporting cycle dropped from 52 hours to 9. The pipeline also caught 3 discrepancies that would likely have caused another restatement. The compliance officer sent me a handwritten thank you note and a bottle of bourbon. In operational work, gratitude like that matters because nobody notices systems when they function correctly. People only notice disasters. Daniel found out 3 weeks later during an executive discussion. He called me into his office immediately. Flat voice, cold expression. You spent 8 weeks on an unauthorized project, he said. You used cloud resources outside budget approval and touched compliance critical data without security review. I explained the compliance officer had approved the work. She is not your manager, he replied. Then he closed his laptop with this small precise click that somehow felt more dismissive than yelling. Your problem is no longer technical, he said. It's cultural. That night, I sat in my driveway for almost 20 minutes. asking myself whether I had actually become reckless. I understood governance. Banking requires controls. Bad integrations can create real risk. But when I reviewed every situation honestly, the pattern became obvious. Daniel wasn't afraid my systems would fail. He was afraid they worked without belonging to him. Over the next several months, he started building an administrative case against me. Formal warnings, documentation reviews, governance concerns. Eventually, I was placed on a performance improvement plan. 4 pages long, carefully written, technically accurate in tiny fragments, while completely dishonest about the larger reality. It described unauthorized resources, project deviations, process violations. It never mentioned the fraud prevented, the deposits retained, the reporting errors avoided. That was the most painful part. The people actually using my systems depended on them every day, while the person controlling my evaluation was trying to turn the value itself into evidence against me. Then came September. Daniel scheduled what he called a technology strategy alignment session with the full executive leadership team, CEO, CFO, COO, division heads, technology leadership. 15 people total. Rumors spread for weeks that he planned to consolidate vendor platforms and eliminate internally developed systems. I still didn't expect what happened next. The presentation started smoothly. Standardization, reduced maintenance costs, vendor governance, lower key person dependency. Some of it was reasonable. Then he reached a slide labeled current technical debt and risk exposure, my fraud model, my churn system, my compliance pipeline, all listed as fragmented, unsanctioned solutions with single point of failure risk. I sat there listening while he stripped every business outcome out of the story. The fraud model became unsupported custom detection logic. The churn system became unauthorized CRM integration. The compliance pipeline became unbudgeted cloud infrastructure. Every technical detail was partially true. Every important result had been removed. Then came the final slide. Recommended actions. Sunset all 3 systems. Expand the Apex Insight contract. Replace internal development with vendor-managed solutions. Then, Daniel looked directly at me. The organizational risk of systems, dependent on one individual, outweighs any short-term performance benefit they may provide. And right there, in front of the executive team, he archived all 3 systems in the internal repository. Scheduled jobs disabled before midnight. The room went silent. Except for the projector humming overhead, something inside me became very still. Not calm, final. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed inside my jacket pocket. I ignored it until the meeting paused. Then I stepped into the hallway and checked the message. Nathan Cole, CTO of North Star Financial Technologies. We had met at a banking conference about 18 months earlier and stayed loosely connected. His message was short. He had heard through industry contacts that I might be at a crossroads. He wanted to talk immediately if I was available. I stood there staring at the screen for almost a minute. Some life-changing moments don't feel dramatic. Sometimes it's just a woman standing alone outside a conference room, realizing one door has closed while another quietly opened. I called him. That conversation changed my future faster than every strategy meeting at Brighton combined. Nathan didn't flatter me. He spoke directly. North Star was building analytical infrastructure for mid-market banks. He already knew about Brighton's fraud improvements, the customer retention numbers, the compliance automation. More importantly, He understood those results came from a person, not a vendor platform. By the end of the call, he offered me the position of Chief Data Officer. $310,000 base salary, equity. Full authority to build the data organization from the ground up. But the thing that affected me most wasn't the money, it was this. For the first time in months, someone saw the value before asking me to defend it. When I walked back into the meeting room, Daniel looked at me with the polite expression people wear when they believe they've already won. He asked whether everything was all right. I looked around the room. The compliance officer who depended on my reporting pipeline, the CIO who had seen the retained deposit numbers, the executives listening to $7 million of annual value being described as operational risk. Then I said, since everyone was present, I had something to share. Announced my immediate resignation and my acceptance of the Chief Data Officer role at North Star Financial Technologies. Then I calmly stated exactly what the archive systems had produced. More than $2.1 million in fraud prevention, nearly $4.8 million in retained deposits, about $144,000 annually in compliance labor savings. Said those numbers had been removed from the context presented that day, and the teams depending on those systems deserved that clarification. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel's composure cracked, only slightly, but enough, he said. There were proper offboarding procedures, and that executive meetings were not appropriate for personal announcements. I replied that since he had chosen a public setting to characterize my work as a liability, it seemed appropriate to correct the record publicly too. Then the CFO started asking him questions, real questions, financial impact, transition exposure, fraud performance. I picked up my notebook and coffee cup and walked out. The next day, I signed my letter with North Star. 3 weeks later, Brighton's Chief Compliance Officer called me professionally, asking whether North Star offered regulatory infrastructure consulting. A week after that, the retail vice president called because customer closures had jumped 31% after the churn system went offline. The truth was returning to the table without me dragging it there. Over the next few months, North Star signed consulting agreements with Brighton to rebuild and properly productionize versions of the systems Daniel had archived. The fraud team tested the expanded Apex configuration Daniel wanted and discovered its detection performance was significantly worse than the internal model he eliminated. The board reportedly had difficult questions afterward. Daniel left Brighton in February to pursue other opportunities. Corporate language for a conversation that had already ended. I won't pretend part of me didn't feel something settle correctly when I heard the news, but stronger than satisfaction was something simpler. The work survived. That mattered most. Fraud prevented. Customers retained. Reports corrected before regulators saw them. No one can fully erase results once they enter the real world. Today, at North Star, the systems are rebuilt properly, fully documented, governed correctly, supported by teams instead of individuals. Exactly the way Daniel once claimed they should be. The difference is that now they generate revenue for the company that understood their value, when the company that created them did not. The younger engineers on my team sometimes ask what to do when their instincts are right, but the process disagrees. I tell them this: do the work that matters. Document everything, because real work leaves evidence behind long after someone tries to bury it. Your reputation is not built only in performance reviews. It's built in systems. People miss the moment they disappear, and sometimes someone else's delete button is really just a starting gun.